Hi there. It's a crisp Saturday morning here in Wisconsin, and coming to you with week three's Paulian Provocations. That is, some guides to the reading, some things to consider as you're working through the readings for this coming week. Let's start with the Gospel of Thomas. If you've never encountered this text from the history of early Christianity, I encourage you to do so. Spend some good time with it. It's pretty amazing. Could be very early, could be earlier than the Synoptic Gospels, depending upon which historical interpretation and which scholar's opinion you value the most. Much of it will seem familiar. The basic theme is the light within. So groups like the Quakers and other mystics have found this a source of considerable reinforcement for their point of view. Pay special attention to a couple key chapters, or sayings, number 22, and ask yourself the question when you read this, what if this was the word, or what if these words were the words of the historical Jesus, of the actual Jesus? What if Jesus' teachings were this gender bending? What would be the implications for teaching about sexuality in the church today, for instance? And why couldn't you teach about this, given that we don't know for certain about the authenticity of any of these sayings, just as the Gospels themselves are a mishmash of sources. Jesus as a prophet in saying number 52, also worth considering and taking a look at. But really read the whole thing and spend some time with it. It will repay your labor with some significant insight, I believe. And then 64 as well, one of my favorites. Buyers and merchants will not enter the places of my Father. You can go to my book on sacred places and shopping malls if you want to hear how I apply this basic attitude of Jesus toward the cultural conventions of his time, the shopping mall owners and developers, in short. Okay, enough for the Gospel of Thomas for now, the light within. Jesus as a teacher of the light within. In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, spend some time with this as well. Please don't confuse it with the Acts of Paul, which is a different apocryphal account. But the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Thecla's a pretty amazing woman. If you spend some time reading it, of course, the story is embellished historically. We don't know much about who the historical Thecla was. But it is one of the key texts from early Christianity that really focuses on a woman and her character. She baptizes herself. She clearly preaches and teaches as well. Pay attention as well to how the character Paul is described as a corrupter of wives because of his teaching about chastity. So those two texts then feed into the question of canon and more generally the role of the person of Jesus and interpretations of him, the diverse interpretations in early Christianity. To MacCulloch then, chapter 2 and 3. Let's start with the chapter on Israel. Page 48, note the importance of water. Just because of the very geography of the Holy Land, an important point often missed, and of course a source of considerable geopolitical conflict and contestation. Page 53, roughly, MacCulloch I think is accurate that Israel as we know it takes root in about 1200 BC, first found in an Egyptian inscription. And MacCulloch's description is good. What we're dealing with here are marginalized people settling in Canaan, where they then take on a new identity focused on the character of one God. That is the importance of monotheism. Hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Page 56. MacCulloch makes the startling assertion, I wonder what you think about this, that the first 1,000 years from David to Jesus that is really the first millennium of Christian history. If you look at the notions that are directly linked between that history and Christianity as we know it today, a couple of the key ideas, the notion of the canon, notion of the covenant, the importance of the temple and more broadly, the importance of pilgrimage to the temple that emerges. Interesting tension between universalism and particularism in the Hebrew scriptures. And then, of course, the importance of the synagogue, the place of assembly, along with what happens in association with the synagogue or places of assembly, prayer, celebration of festivals, Passover Seder, which was a home ritual, but the Passover festival more broadly, and then the whole range of Jewish festivals that we understand down to today. So this significance is often missed, that Christianity, of course, in its first 1,000 years, really took root within Israel. Page 58, the prophets. The primary job of prophets, according to MacCulloch, was to talk about the present. And the prophets generally tend to indict all of society in their critiques, important stream, and again, continuity down to today, and certainly in the character of Jesus as well. Important to consider as we're talking about the intolerance of Christianity, that the Maccabees and the Maccabean histories are important within Israel, and perhaps, according to MacCulloch, some of the most important stories in Jewish history, and tend to get overlooked by Protestant Christians in particular. I think MacCulloch's right about that, and worth considering, namely that there is this warrior, rebellious sort of undercurrent within the history of Judaism that then feeds into Christianity in all kinds of interesting ways, as we shall see. Tanakh, the acronym that describes the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's important to call it that. Old Testament, of course, has supersessionist tendencies, and so when I speak about the Hebrew Scriptures, including from the pulpit, I will use the acronym Tanakh, which is how the Jewish people recognize that collection of texts. That's page 67 in MacCulloch. 68 and 69, the importance of Alexandria and the Jewish community in diaspora from the Holy Land. Alexandria will become an important city in the history of Christianity as well, giving birth to two major thinkers in particular, Clement and Origen. And even more, really centered to preserve the literary traditions of the early church, and merging the literary traditions of the Greeks, and especially the notion of allegory, with both Jewish and early Christian thought. And here the key character is Philo of Alexandria as a bridge. Pages 70 to 71, long discussion by MacCulloch about the emergence of the idea of afterlife and the soul. Significantly, MacCulloch argues this is related to war deaths in the Maccabean revolts. That is the idea of the afterlife as a reward for those who lost their lives in battle, then merged with the notion of the soul coming from Plato. Gives rise in a direct connection to the Christian concern with the afterlife that sometimes borders on the obsessional, as MacCulloch puts it, rather tongue-in-cheek on page 71. Then 72 to the end of the chapter, Jewish diversity in Jesus' time. Many of you will already have been familiar with the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. But notice that the splintering within Judaism is the consequence of empire. That's how empires worked. Empires divide to conquer. And this division of this minority group, oppressed group, against itself is how empires worked then, and how they work now as well. Chapter 3 then, and there's of course something important to say in that observation about identity politics and the way it marks American society as well. It's maybe an essay somewhere down the road. Anyway, chapter 3 then on Jesus and Paul. I like what MacCulloch says on page 77 about the Gospels as a down market variety of biography. I think that's pretty accurate. And this observation is absolutely crucial, that for MacCulloch, the poor, the ill-educated, and the disreputable are the ones whose encounters with God are most vividly demonstrated in the Synoptic Gospels. Absolutely accurate and absolutely crucial to consider as well. Certainly meshes with what we learned from Horsley about the social location of the earliest Christians as well. Page 79. The Gospels agree in hardly any detail about Jesus' infancy. This is troubling for your Christmas pageants and your congregations, but actually opens up all kinds of possibilities to communicate how clearly, as MacCulloch puts it, Jesus transcends petty conventions of behavior in Jewish society. His family background is a mess, and his relationship with his family throughout the course of his life, and this is another key theme in the Gospel of Thomas, if you have a chance to spend some good time with that. His relationship with his family is not exactly conducive to supporting family values as we understand them in contemporary American discourse. Jesus is from Moses, Jesus is from David, Jesus is directly from God, and there's a question of his patrimony as well. So some really interesting theological significance in those mixed historical connections as articulated by the gospel writers. As for the birth of Jesus, MacCulloch has some fun speculating with when the year zero actually happened and pointing out the historical errors that led to the placing of Jesus' birth probably 4 years off. So this would actually be, we're living in the year 2014. I'm happy to have moved all of our time back 4 years for us, according to historical accuracy, if that were the case. The adult Jesus, a public campaign, the second section of this chapter, then some really key attempts by MacCulloch to lift up what he takes to be the sort of essential elements in Jesus's teaching that we can, with some historical certainty, affirm as his. The first is the golden rule. Second is setting one proposition against another. You have heard it said, but I say to you. That rhetorical motif seems pretty characteristic. The use of the word amen amen is a Jesus word, in other words, and it's unusual and distinctive to hear him using it. It's worth pointing out and retrieving in some circles, at least. Employment of irony and satire and sarcasm, especially against the powerful. Obviously teaching in parables, these stories that lead us to a counterintuitive point and that turn conventional expectations upside down. The notion of a coming kingdom, rule, or authority, and again, breaking conventions, the sort of petty conventions, focusing less on the letter of the law and more on its spirit. MacCulloch has a long section on page 88 about the association of Jesus with fire. He wasn't a kind and nice Midwesterner. In fact, images of fire are threats or warnings used in continuity with the apocalyptic tradition. And then MacCulloch lifts up nicely how Jesus employed delicate humor. He made crowds laugh, and unfortunately, many of the readings of the Gospels in solemn, sanctimonious settings tend to miss Jesus' humor, which would have been obvious to listeners in a field in Galilee or in a forum in Caesarea. Jesus was a Jew, important to point out, shouldn't be necessary to point out, but of course an awful lot of damage has been done by forgetting that point. The crucifixion and resurrection, third section of the chapter, MacCulloch's chapter, page 91. Note the importance within the Passover meal of Jesus and the emergence very quickly of associations with death, sacrifice, and thanksgiving in that crucial meal. Page 92, the Romans killed Jesus, and MacCulloch puts it nicely. It would have been better for the moral health of Christianity if the blame had stayed with Pilate. Of course, what we have in much of the anti-Jewish polemic, and especially the Gospel of John, is the emergence of tension between the Jesus communities and the established ongoing Jewish communities, and resentment by the Jesus followers at having been expelled or otherwise badly treated by those in the synagogues, especially heightened again by the role of empire and the way empire divides to conquer oppressed peoples. Worth pointing out that Emmaus, the site of the first, are the appearance of Jesus and the celebration of this meal, where the disciples recognize Jesus in the eating of this meal and the breaking of the bread, was also the site of the first victory of Maccabean heroes against the empire. And the meaning of this for the resurrection is pretty profound if you start considering it. That is, what does a resurrection mean in an imperial context? How does the very notion of resurrection challenge the power of empire to impose death on those who are deemed subversive or otherwise threats to the force associated with imperial rule? And of course, this becomes quite clear in then the central affirmation of early Christians that Jesus is Lord. That's a historical reference. MacCulloch's careful to point out that as a historian, he doesn't take a stance on this one way or another. Does a nice job saying how the resurrection points to a different kind of truth than historical veracity, and I think that's nicely put. Truth has many forms. There's deeper truth than the literal. And MacCulloch also nicely, I think, lifts up how it's crucial for him as a historian to dig into the theological debates, even though many readers of the New York Times book review and things like that may not be the most interested in those arcane debates, but I trust we will be interested in those arcane debates, and MacCulloch does a really fine job of sort of tracing us through them in a way that doesn't make us too weary, but definitely digs into the details. And as my favorite paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould put it, God dwells among the details as well. So we'll pay attention to those theological disputes as we encounter them. The Apostle Paul then, MacCulloch's section on Paul is actually pretty weak. I thought he does highlight nicely that Paul's a convert preaching to converts, probably to the God reverers, these Gentile benefactors of the diasporic Jewish communities. Maybe, maybe not. That's a hypothesis on the part of some scholars of Paul. Definitely, though, highlights how Paul taught in paradoxes and identifies quite clearly the connection between Paul and Luther in a nice passage. It's page 99. Identifies how Paul is the one who gave us the church as we understand it today in many ways. That is both in the idea of the local gatherings, the assembly, and in the body universal as well. It gave us the notion of the Spirit. And yet MacCulloch's section really downplays, I think, and overlooks the importance of the cross for Paul. And he could have drawn a pretty clear connection, I think, between Pauline teaching and the historical Jesus by emphasizing the cross, and then also by drawing a thread between the way it was the empire who took Jesus out, the Romans killed Jesus, and then Paul's emphasis on the cross and the resurrection as the victory of Jesus and of Christians over all of the powers of the world, and including the empire. So reading Paul in light of empire is where many Pauline studies have gone in the past decade or so, and unfortunately MacCulloch, it's one of the weaker sections of an otherwise fine book. And then finally the section on the Gospel of John in the book of Revelation. John's a gospel unto itself, as you are well aware. MacCulloch does a nice job of, or at least I hope you're well aware, you'll become well aware through your New Testament courses. Jesus' I am passages really lift up the kind of high Christology that the synoptics and the Gospel of Thomas don't make the same kind of pretenses to. The book of Revelation, again, on the theme of empire, important to consider. The Revelation Christian fury at the attempt to reinstitute or revitalize emperor worship. And MacCulloch puts it nicely on page 103. Revelation is the one book of the New Testament that particularly relishes the subversiveness of Christian faith. So no surprise that it's been used by oppressed groups and Christians under persecution time and time and time again as a book of hope for us. So anyway, chapter ends with the Jewish revolt and the end of Jerusalem. So again, that connection between Christianity and violence and destruction, and again, imperial massacres. What happened in Jerusalem was, and in Israel, was that Jewish rebels took over, massacred the Sadducee elite. That section of Jewish leadership who appeared to be collaborating with Herod, the Herodians, and the emperor, and the empire more broadly. So MacCulloch points out on 110, and I think I'll end with this. It's already gone too long. Apologies. The very name Christian embodies a violent history which had set Rome versus Jerusalem. And the word has resonated down nearly 2,000 years, during which Christianity, in turn, has set itself against its surviving parent, Judaism. That's tragic. Plot within the history of Christianity, the long history of Christianity, but very clearly has roots in the reaction of the Jewish people to empire, and understanding Jesus' place in that history and Paul's place, and then especially the grassroots Christians such as Thecla in relationship to that history and in relationship to empire is absolutely crucial. I hope you have a great week of study. I'll be reading your papers from week 2 on my flight into Philadelphia tomorrow afternoon after I preach in Green Bay. I guess go pack go would be how I would put it, but wearing my Temple sweatshirt today to represent. I'll be in Philly just briefly, pretty much all day Monday evening. I'll be happy to meet with you if occasion permits during the day, and then fly out Tuesday morning after I get my Uber from campus. But I'll be back again at some other junctures, but hope you have a great week. Peace.